Okay, welcome to Marx School number 33. And again, very good morning to Radhika. And today's discussion is on US imperialism after Afghan defeat. And the speaker is Professor Radhika Desai from University of Minnesota, Winnipeg. I welcome all of you living in different time zones. So I can't say good morning to everybody. So I would say like Australian good day. And today's discussion is will be moderated by Dr. Priya Singh. She's the Associate Director of Asia in Global Affairs and a research fellow of Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad Institute of Asian Studies. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Priya Singh to moderate the discussion. So it's over to Priya.
Thank you so much, Samani. And it's good evening from Kolkata and good morning to you, Radhika. And it gives me immense pleasure to introduce our illustrious speaker very briefly, because it's a never-ending profile that you have. Dr. Radhika Desai is professor at the Department of Political Studies and Director, Geopolitical Economy Research Group, University of Manitoba, Winnipeg. She is the author of numerous books. Some of them include Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, Slouching Towards Ayodhya from Congress to Hindutva and Indian Politics, and Intellectuals in Socialism, Social Democrats in the Labour Party, which was a New Statesman and Society Book of the Month. And she's also been the co-editor of Russia, Ukraine, and Contemporary Imperialism, a special issue of the International Critical Thought, Theoretical Engagements in Geopolitical Economy, Analytical Gains from Geopolitical Economy, Revitalizing Marxist Theory for Today's Marxism, and Developmental and Cultural Nationalisms. She's contributed to the Economic and Political Weekly, International Critical Thought, New Left Review, Third World Quarterly, World Review of Political Economy, and many others. She also serves on the editorial boards of many journals, including Canadian Political Science Review, Critique of Political Economy, the World Review of Political Economy, and International Critical Thought. Without wasting much time, Radhika, over to you. You have 45 minutes to an hour to speak on Afghanistan, and after which, we shall have a discussion, I think, for half an hour or so. Radhika, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Priya, and thank you to Samane and others in the Marx School for inviting me. I've said hello to Kalpa, and also I should say hello to Senani, who I see here, who I'm friends with on Facebook with, and so it's good to see everyone here. Right, so I want to say a few things about the US defeat in Afghanistan and what it means really for the history of imperialism. And I should also say that what I have to say, in what I have to say, I'll be, of course, referring to my various works here and there, books, articles, and so on. But in particular, I'll be referring to my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy. And I will also be referring to something I would like to interest you in, which is a manifesto that some of us have recently produced. I've just put the link in the chat for everyone if they are interested. Because the manifesto is important, because what we've tried to do is we've tried to give our readers a sense of where we are at in the history of world capitalism, in particular in the history of the battle between capitalism and socialism, which is already a very long one, and it will continue. But I would argue, and so this is what my main point will be, is that the the events of the last couple of months really constitute a tipping point in the history of imperialism, particularly of the US imperial project. And I'd underline US imperial project because I see it more as a project than as a fait accompli, as we will see. So I want to sort of refer to these two things in particular. So let me just begin by saying that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan has been seen in the mainstream largely as something that is good in itself, although the manner in which the Biden administration withdrew from Afghanistan is faulted in this way or that way or what have you. So it's all a focus on the manner in which it has been faulted. But in general, and those who are critical of it generally invoke the idea that somehow the war had been about Afghan women or something like that. But in reality, the occupation, as you are all quite aware, and I'm looking forward very much to the discussion phase, it has the occupation itself, the original invasion, the occupation, and then its long lasting character have all been an extremely complex set of events that need unpacking. And they reveal more about the limitations of US power than they reveal about US power intrinsically. Now, if in the mainstream, this has been seen largely as, oh, Biden was right to get out, but it was the way he did it that was problematic, or maybe he should have left a few thousand more troops there, or these sorts of comments. I think on the left, there has been a slightly different sort of discourse. So now, as you may be aware, on the left, the dominant discourse about the United States has always been about American imperialism. And there are all those people who argue that American imperialism is super powerful and it still exists and so on. So inevitably, there are those even today who say that the US may have lost in Afghanistan, but American imperialism is going nowhere. This is a title of one of Gilbert Achcar's writings. And so there is this whole school of people who've always essentially talked up the power of American imperialism. There are some other types of comments as well. So one article in the New Yorker, for example, which is again a kind of, I'm just referring to those who use the term imperialism, or empire, which is a slightly different thing. So is the US withdrawal from Afghanistan the end of American empire? Asks an article in the New Yorker by John Lee Anderson. And the answer that he gives is only time will tell. Whether the old adage about Afghanistan being a graveyard of empires proves as true for the United States as it did for the Soviet Union. So obviously, here what's happening is that there are a couple of comparisons that have, of course, come up. One is comparison with the Soviet Union, another inevitably, as we saw people, American personnel being airlifted out of Kabul. The image was invoked of US personnel being lifted out of Vietnam. Okay, so that is a second sort of a thing, and here also I should add that talking about US imperialism and US empire are two quite different things. So US imperialism has generally been a trope of the left. In generally, so for example, I'm talking about, people like the Kolkos, or people like the Beards, or people like William Appleman Williams, etc. People who indicted, Sidney Lenz, who indicted American imperialism, and so on. But US empire is very much a Bush era trope, and the idea is again the criticism is much more ambiguous, and the idea is simply to talk about the scale and nature of American power. And you'll see how my own analysis in geopolitical economy and in the approach that I call geopolitical economy differs quite significantly from both of these approaches, although it's closer to the first, that is to say the Marxist critique of American imperialism, but we'll come to that. Another writer writing in the New York Times talked about the US withdrawal in these terms. He said, you could think, as I do, that it's a good thing that we finally ended our futile engagement in Afghanistan. But you can still fear that some of the possible consequences of the weakness and incompetence exposed in that retreat. So, and further he goes on to say, and applied to American empire as a whole, this fear points to a hard truth. You might think that our country, namely the United States, his country, would be better off without imperium entirely. But there are very few paths back from empire, back to just being an ordinary nation that don't involve a truly wrenching fall. Now, here again, you see essentially a type of discourse which kind of says, look, which admits, it has to admit, that empire has been very costly to Americans. Empire has been costly, not just in terms of life and treasure, but also been costly in terms of how the American economy has had to be distorted in order to support it and so on. So these costs are admitted, but at the same time, you sort of insert something into it saying that, we kind of have to deal with the fact that we are an empire and we should somehow, it's going to be too costly to stop being one, sort of thing. Yet another example is, does Afghanistan mark the end of American empire? Is another writer in writing for Al Jazeera this time, who concludes by saying the American appetite for entering into conflict to preserve global dominance seems to be abating. So here there's some idea that this seems to be abating. And of course, there are quite a few left websites that celebrate a major defeat of American imperialism. So this is the kind of range of views we are seeing on the left, or at least on the part of those who are at least willing to be critical of American policies in terms of their purposes, not just their means. My own view is that, as I said, American defeat in Afghanistan is a tipping point. After this, American decline will visibly, manifestly accelerate. And I mean this in both the political economy sense and in terms of in military and geopolitical terms. Now, the key obstacle to understanding this is the spin that is put by official government sources, massively assisted by all of mainstream journalism, and also by all of mainstream journalism, by pretty well all of American mainstream scholarship, and a considerable portion of what we call left scholarship. So all those people who claim to be on the left but still talk up American power, they have a very peculiar way of dealing with this. So let me just give you an example. I want to give you an example both from the sort of the straightforward military end, and then it's an example that I have discovered from the political economy end. So here's the military end. Now, as you know, the Washington Post some time ago in 2019 published the Afghanistan papers, which was essentially an enormous document dump that revealed a lot of things about the character of the US involvement in Afghanistan. And out of this, they sort of spun out a whole bunch of articles based on that. And in one of the articles, a senior National Security Council official is quoted as follows. He says, this is in 2016, it was impossible to create good metrics, that is to say, create good metrics about the situation in Afghanistan. We tried using troop numbers trained. So, how many Afghan troops have you trained? We tried using violence levels, saying, violence has gone down. We tried using control of territory, but none of it painted an accurate picture and a good picture. The metrics were always manipulated for the duration of the war. So what this tells you is that the Americans had been losing the war more or less all the way through, apart from that very swift victory, and the taking of Kabul in the early years into 2001, 2002, etc. After that, it had been all downhill from there. And so it was always a problem. How do you portray this? And of course, in the United States, the other thing that happens in practically all US wars is the enormous number and variety of different motivations involved in going to war in the first place. So there may be this or that actual objective to be achieved on the ground, take this territory or whatever, or to remove the Taliban or what have you. But there is also the systematic need to continue to feed the military-industrial complex, because every war is like Christmas for the military-industrial complex. It is full of gifts, extraordinary gifts to the military-industrial complex. So there are you there in order to fulfill any objectives, or are you there so that simply you can sell more and more arms and so on? Now, further then, this article goes on, even when casualty counts and other figures look bad, the senior NSC official said, the White House and the Pentagon would spin them to the point of absurdity. Suicide bombings in Kabul were portrayed as a sign of the Taliban's desperation, that the insurgents were too weak to engage in direct combat. Meanwhile, a rise in US troop deaths were cited as proof that American forces were taking the fight to the enemy. So whether things are going well or badly, you always have to twist it around to make it look as though they are going well. It was their explanations, the senior NSC officials said. For example, the attacks are getting worse. That's because there are more targets for them to fire at. So more attacks are a false indicator of instability. Then 3 months later, are the attacks still getting worse? It's because the Taliban are getting desperate. So it's actually an indicator that we are winning. This went on and on, he says, for 2 reasons. To make everyone involved look good, and to make it look like the troops and resources were having a kind of effect where removing them would cause the country, namely Afghanistan, to deteriorate. In other field reports sent up the chain of command, military officers and diplomats took the same line. Regardless of the conditions on the ground, they claimed that they were making progress. So this is the kind of and one other final point. So now he's quoting Michael Flynn, a retired 3-star Army general who told government interviewers in 2015, from the ambassadors down to the low level, they all say we are doing a great job. Really? So if we are doing such a great job, why does it feel like we are losing? So what I want to emphasize here is that the entire enterprise was completely sort of riddled with problems, and it was riddled with signs of failure for a very, very long time. And as you know, President Obama, at one point, there was a big discussion about whether he should be withdrawing troops. And in fact, remember, he got elected on a promise of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. But in the end, he opted for a surge of troops. So this is the atmosphere in which these decisions are being made. And, you know, my own book, Geopolitical Economy, it's of course about the military aspects, but it also treats very seriously another aspect of so-called US hegemony. So essentially, in geopolitical economy, I argue that contrary to the mainstream discourses around the world economy, which either talk in terms of globalization, in which no states matter, that the world economy is unified by markets and national boundaries are completely irrelevant, or they talk in terms of US hegemony, in which only one state matters, that state organizes the whole world economy as though once again it was quite borderless, and its division into a number of nations and national economies was completely inconsequential. So against this, I argue that in reality, states matter. I call this part of the argument the materiality of nations argument. The division of the world into national economies is a function of capitalism itself. Capitalism, contrary to discourses of US hegemony or globalization, actually creates a world divided into a multitude of competing national economies, competing and struggling national economies, I should say. So both competition among established capitalist powers is an important phenomena, and struggles between dominant capitalist powers who are trying to be imperialist and those who would resist them, whether in a capitalist format or a socialist one. These are the drivers of the international relations of the world of capitalism, what Marx actually called the relations of producing nations. Because one of the side arguments I also make is that while this is not central, but I argue that Marx was too smart not to realize this. And it was just that, he's considered as having focused only on classes because that's the part of his unfinished work that he did finish. But throughout his writings, you see his awareness that both classes and nations are agents in the formation and reformation and in the progress and decline of capitalism. And in the fight between capitalism and socialism, both classes and nations are equally important. So if nations are material, if they compete with each other, if they resist imperial oppression, etc., then you should not expect a logic either of a sort of succession of hegemonies of single powers, like, beginning with the Italian city-states and going on to Holland and then to Britain and then to America, etc. And in any case, this I also show that this narrative really does not work, nor is it a case of just expanding markets, creating globalization and so on. On the contrary, it is a dialectic of uneven and combined development between dominant countries that want to preserve the uneven development of capitalism, which gives them a privileged position in the world economy, and other nations who are able to resist. Not all can resist, but many were able to resist. They resisted by engaging in forms of combined development, which is essentially state-directed, protectionist, autonomous national development to challenge the dominance of the existing powers. So the dominant powers want to retain relations of complementarity between their own high value producing economies and the low value production in the subordinated economies, colonies, semi-colonies, etc. And the powers that resist because they want to reject this relation of complementarity and they want to create relations of similarity instead. And this logic, my argument is, has actually, rather than creating a single seamless world economy, it has actually created an economy of nation states. And the dialectic of uneven and combined development, which is Trotsky's term, but the notion exists already in Marx and Engels. This dialectic of uneven and combined development has actually given rise to progressive multipolarity, or what I would also call pluripolarity. This is after I wrote my book, I went for the first time to Venezuela, and there I was told about the fact that Hugo Chavez actually preferred the term pluripolarity, because what it indicates is that because each form of combined development, whether it's the combined capitalist development of Germany and the United States and Japan beginning in the late 19th century, or of the Soviet Union or China or Cuba or wherever in our own time, each of them gives rise to very peculiar and unique social institutions. There are different national capitalisms and different national socialisms. So this creates a kind of it's not just that there are multiple poles of power, but they're all quite different from one another. So that's the idea behind it. So essentially, it has made the world progressively more pluripolar. So if you think about it, already in 1870, when the first contender powers to challenge Britain's dominance by their own state-directed protectionist industrialization, namely the United States, Germany, and Japan, these countries had already made the world quite pluripolar. And since then, it has only become more so, particularly with the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, with the post-war recovery of the Europeans once again, and whatever limited development that did take place in many third world countries. So this has created a pluripolar world, and what we are going to see is only a further expansion of pluripolarity. So the second argument, and this is where I come to the character of American imperialism, why I argue that it is a project that never succeeded, is that essentially, in the early 20th century, American business and policy making elites can see that British power is already being challenged, that it is waning, and they begin nursing a desire to essentially recreate the kind of dominance that Britain enjoyed in the 19th century over the world economy, to recreate it in the 20th century for itself. That is, the United States would enjoy the kind of dominance over the world economy that in the 20th century as Britain had enjoyed in the 19th century. And my argument is that, unfortunately, the Americans, as always, were kind of arrived on the scene a little too late, because no matter how big their economy was, and indeed it was very big, but the world had already become too multipolar for even this very large economy to exercise that kind of dominance. And this happened even though the Americans realized that it can never be the same, because, for instance, most obviously, the Americans could never acquire a territorial empire of the size that Britain had enjoyed, because the world was a completely different place. It was not possible to acquire, in order to acquire such an empire, the United States would have to fight other extremely powerful empires. And it would have to do down rising nationalist resistance, as it was already experiencing in the Philippines, for example. So for all of these reasons, it was not possible for it to do so. And so it decided, okay, we know we can't get a territorial empire, but what we're going to do is we're going to settle for essentially essentially making the dollar the world's money. Okay. And you see, partly because when you read the literature, just like globalization, when you read the literature on American hegemony and empire, one can have a kind of a really, shall we say, a kind of mind-bending experience, because what happens is everybody and their dog has their own definition of what US hegemony means. And indeed, this definition also changes. So if you read the works of Charles Kindleberger with any degree of scrutiny, you will find that his definition of what US leadership consisted in keeps changing all the time. And so I essentially felt that this was all a lot of very problematic. So I essentially then decided that I was going to gauge the success or failure of the American hegemonic project, which I've just described to you, which is to essentially emulate British style dominance in the 20th century by making the dollar the world's money. I was going to take its own aim as the benchmark against which to measure success or failure, because everybody else was essentially playing some sort of a scholarly game, which was not what I was trying to do. So, and what I basically showed is that the United States did not succeed, and it could not succeed, chiefly because the world had already become too multipolar. Now, so to come back to the question of imperialism, US imperialism, etc., one of the arguments that emerges from all this is that if you think about it, 2014 represents the high noon of imperialism, when the world as a whole was covered with empires, competing empires indeed, which led to the First and Second World Wars and the entire 30 years crisis period. Now, what you had at the end of this period was a very temporary American dominance caused by the wars, because remember, the United States was, it joined the war in 1941, chiefly in order to continue to be able to supply the warring allies, the warring European and Asian theaters with arms and other war material. So its own involvement in terms of troops was relatively limited. And so what the war did was, it on the one hand, of course, destroyed the economies of Europe, Asia, etc. But on the other hand, it vastly boosted the American economy. So between 1939 and 1941, the US economy doubled in size. It doubled in size. It would not double again for another 22 years, even though these were the so-called golden age years of very high growth. So you can imagine the stimulating effect the war had. And people were aware of that. People knew that, people like Keynes, for example, were very aware that the kind of dominance the Americans enjoyed at the end of the Second World War was an artifact of that war. It would end very soon, and they were very reluctant to give the US dollar the world role that the US claimed. And the US only managed to acquire it, on the one hand, by essentially nixing all alternatives, including the one posed by Keynes. And on the other hand, saying, trying to mollify the other powers by saying, look, we'll back it with gold. We are going to make sure that we will continue to exchange the dollar with gold at $35 an ounce, etc. And this also shows you that, even though the United States power was very great at the end of the Second World War, it was not unlimited. It had to make this compromise. It had to say, we'll back it with gold. Anyway, so now I've told you all of these things. So my own view is that the dollar system never really worked. Throughout the 1960s, the dollar was in one or other form of trouble. Already in 1961, a gold pool had to be created because too much gold had flowed out of the United States. And by 1971, even these attempts to shore up the dollar's role were at an end. So the dollar's gold link had to be broken. And my argument since then is that what looks like a long series of, essentially continuous dollar dominance after 1971 is actually created, the illusion is created by a series of what I call dollar-denominated financialization. So essentially what has happened is that in order to shore up demand for the dollar, you create an artificial financial demand for it. So you had a vast expansion of lending in dollar terms and the recycling of petrodollars in the 1970s. In the 1980s, the Japanese were convinced to buy vast quantities of American securities and so on. And by the 1990s, you had the dot-com bubble and then the 2008, 2009 the housing and credit bubbles that burst in 2008. So all of these were the financializations on which the dollar's role had rested. Now, just as I quoted to you how the US occupation of Afghanistan is made to look good, no matter what's actually happening. So similarly, there's a whole industry around talking up the dollar's world role. So, if the dollar's value is high, they say, oh, look, the dollar's value is high. Everybody wants the dollar. If the dollar's value is low, they will argue, well, look, even though the dollar's value is low, it survives as the world's currency. So everything is going hunky-dory. So all of these discourses are a way of not looking at what really happens inside. Now, I'm not going to go into what really happens inside. I will merely say that the Triffin dilemma, which is that the Americans provided the world with liquidity by running deficits, and the bigger the deficits were, the greater the downward pressure there was on the dollar. The Triffin dilemma never went away. And so the financializations have served to counteract it to a limited extent, but now we are coming to a real crunch point, and I'll come back to that later. So this kind of discourse prevents us from seeing that the Americans never actually succeeded in establishing their hegemony, so to speak. So, and today, and remember also that the Americans have also never won a war. They had to agree to the division of Korea. They were defeated in Vietnam. They may, and since Vietnam, of course, every American administration has been sort of seized with this desire to undo the Vietnam syndrome, the humiliation of losing a war to essentially a nation of peasants. And I would say that today, the withdrawal from Afghanistan after a defeat that had already happened many decades before, a decade or two before, this is an even more humiliating, because if you think about it, Vietnam was at least backed by China and Russia. They were backed by superpowers. Today, or at least one superpower. In Afghanistan, they have lost without the Taliban actually being backed by any power. Okay, so that's another point I want to make, and I should also say, so that's why it signals the tipping point, and I'll come to exploring all the different parts of this tipping point. So, and I would say that the US decline can only accelerate after this. Now, I also want to say one other thing about this, which is that this is obviously an argument about imperialism. So the high point of imperialism was 1914. Since then, it's been on its way down, and the United States' effort to try to organize its own and the world's affairs in a way as to establish its dominance over it has never succeeded. On the contrary, what we have witnessed is that although it has huffed and puffed, and although it has inflicted a lot of damage, for example, the lost decades of development inflicted on so many third world countries in the 1980s and 1990s are very real, and I do not wish to discount them at all. But what you saw at the end of those 2 decades was actually the continuing unraveling of American power. So, the United States victory in the Cold War came at a time when actually the American economy was itself at a very, very weak point. Increasingly worried about competition from elsewhere and so on. And this American economic decline has continued. American financialization in order to prop up the dollar also continued, but it is now at a point where, again, this idea that, if the Americans open a casino, the whole world will come to play. This has not been proved true, because today, all the asset markets, all the key asset markets, even the market for the safest of assets, namely American bonds, have to be propped up by the Federal Reserve. If you look at the expansion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, it tells you how much the Americans have to essentially put into their own casino in order to make it look like it's really working. It's not really working. Okay, so this is also so this argument about imperialism, it's also an argument about capitalism, because I would argue that you see, you could make an argument that if American capitalism could somehow be revived, then everything will be fine. America will be great again. America will get another chance at trying to establish its hegemony over the rest of the world, etc. But I don't think this is possible, because essentially, the early 20th century was also the high point of capitalism. So if Marx had anticipated that once capitalism enters its monopoly phase, it will have fulfilled whatever historically progressive role, fulfill its historically progressive role. And after that, it could only be a sort of burden on the necks of humanity. And if you think about it, this happened. So the monopoly phase was already there by the early 20th century. And this kind of capitalism, as I said, led to these two world wars. And after the two world wars, insofar as capitalism experienced a golden age of growth in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was only because a capital, that is to say, in the imperialist heartlands of capitalism itself, the governments borrowed many measures and techniques from the socialist copybook. That is to say, welfare states were instituted, full employment was pursued, state ownership was pursued, etc. And all of this created the context in which capitalism enjoyed a big expansionary phase. And when that came to a crisis in the 1970s, imperialist countries faced a crossroads. Shall we continue to deepen the socialistic measures, which would mean that you would be moving further away from capitalism, etc.? Or shall we remove these socialistic measures? Shall we remove the shackles of the unions in order to leave capital free to become more competitive and dynamic and vigorous again? And so that was the line that was taken. But in reality, if no matter how much freedom you give to an already senile and extremely sick patient, it's not going to revive. So throughout the neoliberal decades, capitalism has not revived. And that's why we see the spectacle today of the world economy. And so this is for the first time in the history of capitalism, the growth of the world economy will be powered by a socialist country, by an avowedly socialist country, namely China. Because the capitalism, China is part of this widening multipolarity and is today the leader of it. And and clearly it's doing very well compared to the neoliberal, financialized, enervated and senile forms of capitalism. Okay, so now, having laid that background, let me, and I hope it wasn't too confusing, I'm trying to compress a lot of things into it, but I'm looking forward to our question and answer. So in the final part of my talk, let's look at the dimensions of the American defeat. So militarily, I've already said, the Americans have never won a war. The Vietnam syndrome was never reversed. What's the point of gaining, swift victories over the Grenada and Panama when in fact you cannot do this? You cannot even win over a country like Afghanistan. Like I said, it's always had mixed motives. It's never very clear whether the Americans are going to war in order to fulfill any particular objective. Remember, the grounds on which the Americans have gone to war recently, whether it is in Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or wherever, they were always questionable. Was it really about weapons of mass destruction? Was it really about Osama bin Laden, etc., etc.? They're always, and the ever-present military-industrial complex, which economically is more and more important for the United States as the rest of its manufacturing suffers. Basically, the American economy is turning into one where either it's centered around, production of arms and a few other sectors, such as, say, big pharma or IT and so on, where the defense of intellectual property rights is very critical. And therefore, again, they have to be forcefully defended. And of course, militarily, it's mixed signals about what it's doing there. Is it in Afghanistan in order to defeat the Taliban, in order to capture Osama bin Laden, in order to liberate Afghan women from presumably Afghan men, in order to create Afghan democracy? You name it. It's all all of this verbiage floats around. A lot of people end up believing it, but they, since this is not really the truth, they cannot actually support the US cause in any way. So even allies get confused. And of course, mission creep, what's called mission creep in Afghanistan, happens because of the existence of the military industrial complex. So this is the military situation. And I should add another point, which is, of course, that the United States, the Trump administration came to power with its America First policy. And after that, the Biden administration is anxious to assure its allies that America is back. America is going to create an alliance of democracies and, create a broad front to take up the challenge of China and so on. But practically everything the Biden administration has done seems to have alienated their allies, whether it is the manner of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, apparently about which the allies were not particularly consulted, the creation of this AUKUS alliance with Australia, which has, of course, made Macron apoplectic, and many other such things. So really, in many ways, the Biden administration, precisely because it has to obey the same political, cultural, social, and economic logics that created the Trump presidency, is increasingly looking more and more like the Trump presidency rather than the anti-Trump that Biden was elected to be. Okay, let's look at the fiscal situation. So, I think that one of the key reasons for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was initiated already under Trump, and remember, Obama had already been talking about it a decade ago, even though the military industrial complex persuaded him to do otherwise, because after the 2008 financial crisis, essentially the dollar system was already sufficiently weakened that the United States authorities knew that they were likely overplaying their hand if they continued to essentially borrow money from the rest of the world in order to finance their military and, well, on the one hand, their military operations, and on the other hand, tax cuts at home. Because remember, the rich have had, the American deficits, the government deficits are as much because of tax cuts as anything else, tax cuts and military expenditures. So this situation has been worsening throughout the decade. And as you know, in the course of the pandemic, the American debt has gone from circa 21 trillion to circa $28 trillion. So it has just, in a single year, it has gone up tremendously. So essentially, tax cuts, continuing high state expenditures on war, on subsidies to capital, etc., have expanded American deficits once again. The rising public debt has also led the Federal Reserve balance sheet to expand, so that the Federal Reserve, which had sort of kept a very low balance sheet up to 2008, saw a very big rise after 2008. And then it kind of stabilized, and there was talk of tapering, selling off all those assets that the Federal Reserve had bought in order to support asset markets. And then COVID hit, which then has actually sent the balance sheet up again. I can show you some pictures later on in the discussion, if you like. So the rising public debt is now a serious concern, and the value of the dollar itself is a serious concern. And that's partly why the Americans the Biden administration has had to talk about increasing taxes, because American policymakers realize that the so-called exorbitant privilege of the US dollar is not real. It's only real insofar as they can keep this casino that I was referring to going. If more and more punters keep coming into your casino, it's fine, but this is no longer the case. It has not been the case since 2008. So there are problems coming. And finally, I want to talk about the economic situation. Essentially, in pursuit of this desire to make the dollar the world's money, practically everything has been sacrificed at the altar of the dollar. So the American economy, throughout the post-war period, and even more so in recent times, has essentially been converted from a relatively high productivity, technologically advanced economy into one which relies on low and stagnant wages, where demand does not expand, which is increasingly indebted, because the ordinary American is heavily indebted. American businesses, American households, and of course the American government are all extremely indebted, to private interests. And so the entire American state is devoted to the enrichment of a tiny financial elite, not to the productive revival of its national economy. So the productive revival of the national economy has been systematically neglected for decades by now. And this is going to continue under Biden. I don't see that changing insofar as there is more of a discussion about a bigger government role. The role of the government will be to serve the interests of big corporations even more blatantly. It will be nothing more and nothing less than that. So I would say that in this context, American economic power is going to decline. The US dollar faces the contradiction that I mentioned to you, but also many others which we can talk about. And militarily, it's very clear that essentially the United States has a military which absorbs a lot of money. It's still the military that spends by far the most on itself in the world. It accounts for around half of world military spending. But despite that, it is actually not capable of winning a war, because this military does not exist to either fight or win wars. The military exists in order to support the military industrial complex. And NATO is also a very important part of that. So, and it is losing allies faster than you can imagine. So you can see that there are very important pressures which are going to lead, for example, the Europeans to increasingly pursue a more and more independent line. In recent decades, it has become very clear that the Europeans have become aware of the need to increase their own independent armament. And if Biden and Trump can go to the Europeans and ask them to spend more money on their military, they'll say, okay, we'll spend more money, but then we will determine the purposes for which we spend money. NATO was all right as long as the Americans were footing the bill for most of it. But if the Europeans are going to be persuaded to spend lots of money on their military, then, the Europeans will say, well, why should we, obey especially after the debacle in Afghanistan, especially after AUKUS, etc. Why should we go along with the Americans? So all of these things are setting the scene for a relatively rapid decline in American power. And that's why I think that American power will decline. So I think I will end there. I've only tried to give you a flavor of my argument. I look forward to the discussion, and including discussing what's happening within Afghanistan, which we haven't talked about very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Radhika. This was absolutely wonderful. I think we can now have the question answer session. And I guess you could raise your hands or use the chat for questions. Questions, please. Okay, so if somebody asks you, I was just wondering, because you were talking about, the fact that you will be speaking about what's happening inside Afghanistan. For those of us who've traveled there, it's never been, American control over Afghanistan. It's this lack of understanding as to what, be it Afghanistan, be it Libya, be it, any other space that it's tried to say that it's occupied. It was all about Kabul. That's about it. So it's never really been spatially, when you look at, when America has been trying to say that it's been in control, or maybe, the media has been trying to say that, or the way it's been projected, it's almost always been, a certain limited sphere. So spatially, this has always been a very false construct.
Spatially, and in at least 2 or 3 other respects. So exactly, and if you've been there, you are far ahead of me. So that's great. I just read about it. But I would say that, what's become really clear, what became really clear, and in fact, it looks as if the Americans kind of knew that. They knew that the government they had been propping up was going to fall. soon after they left. They just didn't think that it would fall even before they had entirely evacuated from Afghanistan. So, and they knew that, and they also knew that it would fall because it was corrupt, because it did not actually control much of the country, that it did not inspire, did not essentially have much legitimacy. And then the army that they had trained also fell apart, simply because, as I think we all know, it falls apart simply because essentially bulk of the money that goes into the army is siphoned off via corruption. The people are, the soldiers, the people who are allegedly trained as soldiers are, they don't get enough compensation to actually be able to overcome the government's lack of legitimacy, because the government is illegitimate. They would have to fight their own sort of compatriots in order to preserve this government, and they were simply not paid enough to do that, and not trained well enough to do that. So this is all, this house of cards essentially evaporated, and it really showed, I think, that this is, the stories that came out as the Taliban took power so quickly, so swiftly, and so bloodlessly, was that in fact it could only happen if it was already controlling or poised to control Afghanistan all along. So and that's why I cited at some length what was discovered in these Afghanistan papers, because that was also known beforehand. But the mainstream American discourse is still pretending as though this was not known, or that somehow it was most unfortunate. But the illegitimacy of the government, the phantom nature of the army, all of these things were known to if anybody actually wanted to know and deal with it, all of these things were known. Why was it not dealt with? Because the war itself was fought with more than just a single motive. The war was, if you are confused about what you're fighting for, then you can remain mired in that war for a very long time, even as you are losing, so long as you have more and more money to push into it.
Absolutely. Can we have some questions now? I think Jude has a question.
Yes, thank you, Professor Desai. I'm just wondering whether it is still, I'm very cautious of saying that the Afghan withdrawal points to a failure or a limits to the American imperialism, the way you describe. What I'm seeing is it's a fundamental changes in the territorial organization of imperialism. If you look at the British imperialism and then the rise of American hegemony, bipolar division of the world, and the current situation. In the current situation, we have a different system of production relation, horizontal organization of production relations. So the American withdrawal points to a restructuring, spatial restructuring of the imperialism rather than limits. One example is that if you look at the control of pipelines, which has a lot to do with the American imperialist project, today the control is taken over by the multinational corporations, right? So I don't know whether Americans are really losing at that front, right? The second point is, I think when we talk about Afghanistan from the perspective of nation state, we forget the fact that Afghan territory doesn't fit into the typical nation state model. Now, when you read from William Kyle's work in 1850s and the Engels commentary on William Kyle's work on Afghan war, 2 volumes on Afghan war, you see the same narrative. This territory doesn't fit. So the people who really use the political realist perspective of understanding Afghanistan make the mistake of describing success or failure of Afghanistan with the wrong framework, because the notion of nation state doesn't apply to Afghanistan, right, compared to all the other territories. So I am very cautious when we say that US is failing. I'm just wondering whether there is whether we are not really understanding where the power works, power relationships work.
Right. So I would say that insofar as we are talking about what you're referring to as a spatial reorganization of imperialism. We already saw the transition from the formal empires of the pre-1914 period to the less formal imperialisms of the post-1945 era. So that transition had already taken place. The Americans do not formally colonize any place. They informally influence things, as do other countries and so on. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that if you feel that the American withdrawal, the Americans said that they are withdrawing in order to concentrate more on the real challenge, which is China and to a lesser extent Russia. But the withdrawal from Afghanistan has precisely removed a major irritant for China and Russia. They never wanted the American presence there. The removal of the Americans from Afghanistan has essentially given China, Russia, the Central Asian republics who have increasingly been opting out of, is refusing the Americans any military bases and so on, joining the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. All of this, and remember, if for the Americans, what would have been a great prize is to retain power over Afghanistan so that it could use the tiny border that Afghanistan shares with Xinjiang to create more problems for China from there. They had already been supporting the East Turkestan Islamic movement, but now they are not going to be able to do that. They claim that they are going to retain some sort of over the horizon capacity. But from what I have read, from what I have read and what I have followed, it seems as though unless you have a substantial presence on the ground, the fact that you can base a few planes and drones in the Middle East is not going to help you. It's not going to allow the Americans to project their power in any serious fashion. So in all of these ways, I agree with you that in many important ways, contemporary imperialism operates through private power. But remember also that private power itself is receding. Take, for example, a very simple matter, which I always emphasize to my students in my international political economy classes. Everybody, when they got all fired up about the rhetoric of globalization and so on, said, oh, look at multinational corporations are so big, half of all the biggest economic entities in the world are corporations and not countries and stuff like that. Turned out that entire statistic was based on a false premise where countries' GDPs were compared to corporation sales, and corporation sales, as you know, involve double counting, whereas GDP avoids double counting. So anyway, the point is that once the correction was made, if you actually correct for that mistake, the overwhelming majority of the top 50 big entities are nations, and not like only a couple of them were countries. And for the rest, all it shows you is that the world has a lot of tiny countries in the world. So fine, big deal. But if you move beyond that, what you realize is that the proportion of production at the world level accounted for by multinationals is around 10%, which means that 90% of production on average in the world is domestic. Investment is domestic, etc. So I agree that, and remember also that the Americans may have, obviously they clearly went to war in Afghanistan in 2001, not because of Osama bin Laden. We don't even know if Osama bin Laden was actually the mastermind behind 9/11. It was because the Taliban were not agreeing to some pipeline they wanted to do. But have they got the pipeline? I don't think so. So, and now the Americans and the Russians will be there. They will be, and clearly Afghanistan is going to need an enormous amount of help financially, in terms of technology, capital, etc. And this help the Americans have never been able to provide them. They've been there 20 years. What did they do? They created a corrupt, ruined economy, which became increasingly reliant on opium production. Presumably the Taliban is going to have to move away from there. We can talk about what sort of force, what is the social character of the Taliban. It's difficult to tell, but we can discuss this. But I really don't see how you can project this as a victory for American imperialism. It is simply not a victory. And like I said, the withdrawal itself is today imposed on the Americans because of their crumbling finances and their crumbling dollar system. So if you put all these things together, I agree. You see, I understand your caution, because what we hear everywhere is people who are talking up American power like there was no tomorrow. And when you keep talking it up, defeats like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, they always come as a surprise. And then an entire cottage industry emerges to try to explain how this could possibly happen. No, actually, it's very understandable. That's what I'm saying. There's a much easier way of understanding it where you don't have to waste time constructing false problems. And the false problems are created precisely because, like the talking up of the situation in Afghanistan, so also the situation of the dollar, of the American economy, etc., is constantly being talked up, and the underlying shambles is not looked at. So that would be my answer. I mean, I would totally respect if you don't agree, but
yeah. So I'm not really saying it's a failure. The question I'm asking is that what does this particular withdrawal, American withdrawal, what role does the American withdrawal plays in the current moment of global capitalism, capital flows, especially in respect to Afghanistan?
Right. So that's another good question. So if you think about it, what is the situation of global capitalism today? The unity of the capitalist countries themselves is deeply in question, particularly, and it's deeply in question. So no, let me start again. The unity of the capitalist countries is deeply in question. That's number one. Number two, the rise of China represents the biggest challenge to these capitalist countries by far, because China is able to maintain stable year-on-year economic growth, even in difficult circumstances. It has been able to, the party state has been able to maintain its legitimacy, and increasingly, as we see in the Huawei affair, you know, I'm sitting here in Canada, where just last week Meng Wanzhou was released, etc. The point is that the technological prowess of China is increasingly a threat to Western power. And finally, these two things are linked. The Europeans and the Americans, if they have a few things to fight about. One of the key things they have to fight about is that the Europeans want to do business with the Russians and the Chinese, and the Americans don't want them to. So this is the situation of global capitalism. And by the way, I'm allergic to the term global. So I will say this is a situation of world capitalism. World capitalism is increasingly threatened by a combination of its own debility and the challenge of China. And the challenge of China is not just any old challenge. It is the challenge of a country that is meaningfully socialist. So all of this creates a very different kind of situation. And by the way, I know I covered a lot of things, but I do very much urge you to take a look at our manifesto, and I've given you the link in the chat, because it covers all of this stuff in a very simple narrative. So if you're interested, please do take a look at it.
Radhika, any other question?
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Sure.
So, Radhika, thanks so much for your very engaging and powerful, for my taste at least, presentation here. I particularly appreciate the wide-ranging, the nature of your perspective here. So I have. Because we can engage what you said at many different levels, and so I want to present broadly, 3 questions, basically inviting you to elaborate a little bit further on some of the issues that you broached. And I hope I present these questions in the most open way possible. So since we are in the Marx school, so I was particularly intrigued by some of your observations on Marx's writings themselves, on the question of imperialism, because and especially with regard, by way of this term that you brought up, partly, in conversation with your Venezuelan comrades, pluripolarity, which is a very interesting, I think, way of thinking about combined and uneven development. So in Marxism more generally, or in the Marxist tradition more broadly, we're used to thinking that, Marx, although he presented a critique of capitalism, he somehow missed out on the problem of imperialism. That it was Lenin and his contemporaries who really, first broached this problem of imperialism, right? So you mentioned in passing that, but we can read Marx, carefully and see in his own writings actually important observations on the nature and the problem of imperialism. So so where do you see this? So if you can kind of give, because again, as I said, this is the Marx school. So can you be a little bit talk like a teacher, to some of us, and perhaps give us some indications about what texts of Marx we should look at, on these kinds of questions. So that's one sort of invitation to you. And the second is a more contemporary kind of perhaps a more contentious kind of a invitation. And that is, obviously, why I find your presentation very interesting and also provocative in some ways is because, clearly there is no consensus on the left about the, and first of all, what we mean by imperialism, but also, on the present situation of the world economy and the nature and extent of American power, right? So so I want to kind of hear from you your own perspective on the diversity of viewpoints that we hear from the left, within the left, and even just within Canada. I mean, for people like you and I, perhaps within the Canadian left, what one might call the hegemonic perspective, on these questions has come from, Leo Panich and Sam Gindin's work over the years, which of course has a kind of a particular perspective on the nature of American power or US hegemony. And so I would invite you to perhaps, contrast your perspective with theirs, but also, other, perspectives on the left, on the present situation. So that's a second kind of invitation. And the third one, this is particularly relevant to Sri Lanka, and this concerns the nature of China, of course, so here again, we have, tremendous debate, within the left, however defined. And so when we talk about in the way that you have suggested, the decline of American power and in relation to the emergence of China, how do we understand this, global, and historic, transition from a left and especially Marxist point of view? Right. So these three things I would like to.
Sure, I would love to. So do you mind if, I can share screen already, so I can do that. So I just wanted to show you a couple of, can you allow me to share screen, please?
Yeah, now you can.
Okay, great. So so let me just take them in turn. So on the first one, you are right. I just wanted to show you this piece I did. It's a fairly short article, and it's called Marx's Geopolitical Economy, the Relations of Producing Nations. And I can send this to whoever wants to see it, or wants a copy of it. So basically, let me just tell this in a slightly subjective fashion. When I first started writing geopolitical economy, I thought I was going to use the idea of American hegemony and essentially world systems theory and hegemony stability theory as my theoretical framework for a critique of globalization discourse. Like, I was going to say that globalization discourse is a lot of hot air, and it is simply a particular phase in the management of American decline. And by that, I was assuming that hegemony stability theory was right, that in the 50s and 60s, America was hegemonic. Then there had been some decline. Then some people say it was revived. It was not revived. I would enter all these debates. But the more I looked at the idea of American hegemony, I realized that it could not be sustained, that there was a lot of slippage. It was very slippery. And to the extent that you could nail it down, you could not sustain it. And so that's what led me off to a further exploration of how should I try to understand, not only the globalization discourse, but the nature of American power by now, which had also become an issue for me. And I found that the best way so I found two things. Number one, the best way of understanding it was through a particular interpretation, which is more or less unique to me, of what Trotsky meant by the uneven and combined development. In that famous first chapter of the history of the Russian Revolution, for him, it is the essential lens through which you try to understand what the Bolsheviks are doing. Now, so this and the second thing I realized is that this was, most people attribute uneven and combined development to Trotsky, and it's true that he came up with the term. But if you look at the actual understanding that underlies it, not only did I find that this understanding is widely shared by his contemporaries like Lenin and Bukharin and Hilferding and others, if you read all their major works on imperialism that came out at this time, but also that you could see it in Marx. And as it happens, this was slightly serendipitous, but I was part of a Marx reading group. And so at that time, we were reading the Grundrisse. And so this article that I showed you, it entirely focuses at the end of the Grundrisse on certain notes that Marx made on the American mercantilist theorist Henry Carey. And what you see there is essentially a full understanding of what Trotsky would later call uneven and combined development. What you see there is a full understanding of what imperialist countries do habitually, and why other countries would resist them. In this case, he was talking about the United States. I also have written an essay on Marx's commentary on another mercantilist theorist, this time German, called Friedrich List. So to my mind, for Marx and Engels, they were totally aware that capitalism, of course, it creates exploitation of class exploitation, but it also creates international exploitation. And that like class struggle, there is also international struggle. And they understand this, and I'm trying, so I lay it out substantially in my book, Geopolitical Economy itself, but I also lay it out here. And by the way, one of the other things I show, and this brings me to your second question, is, what is imperialism? And the way Marx and Engels theorize it, and the way Trotsky does, and the way I would as well, is that imperialism is essentially an imperative for capitalist countries. Now, here is where I'd like to share one other piece that I did, because I think it's, well, let's put it this way. I've written a lot of things, but I'm especially proud of this one. So let me just show you. Share. So this is the article I showed you, and the other piece is this one: Marxist critical political economy, Marxist economics. I put it in quotation marks, and actually occurring revolutions against capital. I can send this to you as well. What I've argued in this piece is that, from a very early stage, beginning in the late 19th century onwards, instead of contesting neoclassical economics, which emerged in good part precisely because Marxism was creating a lot of problems for capitalism. Instead of contesting it, many Marxists became involved in what I consider to be an extremely problematic project, which was to try to fit Marx's understanding into the antithetical theoretical and methodological framework of neoclassical economics, giving rise to Marxist economics. And it has led to a whole load of silly ideas. Marx has a transformation problem. Marx did not think that there was a demand deficit in capitalism. Marx was wrong to think that the rate of profit declines. All of these things are just a whole bunch of false battles that people have spent a lot of time fighting and not doing the right things. Now, why do I bring this up? Because all of this has also tended to eliminate or almost eliminate entirely the notion of contradiction, which for Marx is central to understanding capitalism. So why do I invoke contradictions? Because the contradictions of capitalism are what make imperialism an imperative for capitalist countries. So capitalisms must always try to externalize the consequences of capitalism's contradictions. So the excess commodities, their excess capital, and their reliance on cheapened inputs, whether it's labor or raw materials or what have you. So all of these things, so for me, imperialism is not something that is a choice. There is an entire school within Western Marxism which basically says, imperialism is terribly bad and it's very sad when it happens and it imposes a lot of suffering, but it is not necessary to capitalism. So geopolitical economy says it is necessary because capitalism is contradictory. So both of these things are important. And so imperialism is an imperative that emerges from capitalism. And by the way, this is also tied with another point that I make very forcefully. There is no such thing as pure capitalism. The state is always involved and in creating and recreating capitalism. So capitalism is a very historical phenomenon. So imperialism is that. Imperialism is the desire to have subordinated economic territories upon which you can inflict your excess capital and excess commodities, and from which you can draw cheaply always raw materials, labor, and I feel labor is often neglected. People keep on going on about the overpopulation of third world countries, and they think that labor is something that is always widely available. No, labor is needed for Western countries, and they actually do not, they themselves have social structures that make it very hard to create labor. The reproductive rates of Western societies are very low. So they need to be able to have this tap. When they need labor, they open the tap, they allow a certain amount of labor to come in, and then they close the tap. So this is partly also the functioning of imperialism. So, and this imperialism ideally involves a substantial degree of control over the subordinated territories. And when I say imperialism is in decline, what I'm saying is that the extent of this control is declining thanks to combined development and growing pluripolarity. Okay. So, we can come back to the question of pluripolarity later. Let me just finish this by, and you were saying that in placing this idea of imperialism in the context of other understandings. So basically, I feel that much of the left has a very impoverished understanding of, theoretically poor understanding of imperialism. Partly it is because they deny contradictions, and that's why they don't understand imperialism, they don't understand anti-imperialist resistance, and therefore they do not understand actually occurring revolutions of our time, of the 20th century, of the 21st century, etc. So, in contrast to, a very large part of the left will simply say things like, well, although the third world has become independent, imperialism is as strong as ever. I mean, that is simply false. I mean, it is simply not true that that's the case. Decolonization was a big blow to imperialism. Decolonization also enabled levels of development which were not possible under colonialism. Even in the case of a country like India, which, you can say it has not exactly been spectacular, but India grew much faster. In fact, India never grew did not grow to any appreciable extent under colonialism. From the 1950s onwards, India did grow, even though the growth rate was disappointing to many countries, including in per capita terms. So in these ways, the withdrawal, the decolonization makes a difference. You can't tell me that it's, the same as if it were the British were still around. So that's the first thing. And in the case of the socialist countries, it made an even bigger difference. So that's, so I don't agree with that. And then as far as Leo Panitch is concerned, I mean, I used to know him fairly well, and then we sort of disagreed over too many things but basically Leo drank the Kool-Aid. In the 1990s, I felt that Leo and I agreed a great deal, because we both argued that globalization is not this unstoppable force which is making nations irrelevant. On the contrary, nations are creating it, and nations are the only forces that can resist it. But in the 2000s, Leo drank the Kool-Aid of all the empire discourse, and he produced a Marxist version of it. I never agreed with it. And I think that today, I mean, unfortunately, we lost him last year, which is very sad. But I certainly don't think that his argument was held up, even, in the years since the publication of his book, where American power was visibly declining, is visibly declining. So, you were saying nature of China. Well, so I did write something a while back in which I referred to the whole controversy around the Hanban Tota port and all that. But my memory of that is now a little, I should have looked it up since I was talking to a Sri Lankan audience. But let me just say this for starters anyway. There is a lot of discourse around China's debt trap diplomacy, but it's in fact, most of it is hot air. That, you know, maybe you can tell me more about the Hanban Tota port, but essentially China is more flexible in terms of renegotiating loans and all that. So, and a lot of the times the West takes every opportunity to portray as China's sort of rapaciousness what is in fact a very complex situation in which there are multiple creditors, including Western creditors at stake. And China has to be careful that whatever debt forgiveness it gives does not simply end up in the pockets of Western creditors. And they are being equally cautious, but at the same time, they are ratcheting up tensions with China. What do I think of the nature of the social nature of China? I think that China is meaningfully socialist. Yes, there are a lot of capitalists in China. Yes, they own very large corporations. Yes, many of the capitalists in China are exceedingly powerful. However, the key difference, and yes, they are also members of the Communist Party, but the key difference between a capitalist country like the US or Canada or Britain and China, on the other hand, is that at the end of the day, the reins of policy are in the hands of the party state, not in the hands of capitalists. They are in the hands of a force whose legitimacy ultimately is reliant on providing the people of China what they need in broad terms. And as far as I can tell on my trips to China and my reading about China, I would say that the Chinese party state to this day retains a great deal of legitimacy. So, as I say, you know, I personally feel, for example, that China is still, you know, China is very unequal, but I see also that the party state has had to realize this and try to attack it. You see in recent instances, for example, whether it's Jack Ma or some of these other capitalists who have been brought on the carpet, because at the end of the day, it's not the capitalists who call the shots. It's the party state that calls the shots. And the party state is very mindful that there can be important disturbances that can be created if capitalists are given a free rein, etc. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Radhika. Yeah.
Anybody else? Any other
I'm just wondering, how would Africans look at the kind of Chinese socialism that you're talking about, the kind of natural resource extraction that's going on in Africa, and the internal displacement crisis that within China?
Sorry, the internal
displacement of the ethnic minorities.
Right.
That's going on within China. And the natural resource extraction, when you talk to the Africans, they have a very different perspective of what China is doing in Africa. If you look at the volume and the space of natural resource extraction from Africa to China, or Africa to China, is far more higher in volume than any other colonial powers in the past.
Yeah. I would say a couple of things. First of all, as far as Africa is concerned, I'm sure that you are right that the people you've talked to have a very different perspective than the one I just shared. But there are also many others. So it's partly a question of who you're talking to in Africa, because certainly there is an enormous amount of writing and thinking about what the Chinese mean for Africa, and not all of it is negative. Some of it is very positive, and some other stuff is genuinely questioning, you know, okay, this seems to be good, but is it really? And let's investigate. But at the same time, it's not saying, you know, China. In fact, many of the writers that I've come across would at least say that China is very different from Western imperial powers. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I would say that China is, yes, China wants resources from Africa, but I would say two things about it. China is also investing in African infrastructure and manufacturing, not just resources. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, this only came up, it came in my mind a couple of days ago. As you all know, there's been a lot of discussion about the power cuts in China. And I was reading around it, and it turns out that a large part of the reason why the power cuts are happening is that, on the one hand, because so many economies have been laid waste by COVID, that even more than before, China is the manufacturer of the world. And so all the demand is concentrated on China, and Chinese economy is working full speed to try to produce, to supply the demand that is being placed on it. And the power cuts are happening because despite that, and this naturally involves more use of power, but despite that, the Chinese are still trying to keep up with their carbon emissions commitments. So they're trying to deal with it by imposing power cuts. But really what this makes you realize is that people say China is, consuming all these resources. But really, it's, remember I was earlier talking about multinational corporations, and one of the points I didn't get to make is that actually multinational corporations aren't investing in third world countries. What they're doing is they're contracting, like Walmart contracts with Chinese companies to supply them with everything, whether it's toasters or washing machines or whatever it is they're selling from China. So Chinese capitalists are producing, or Chinese companies, whatever they are producing these goods, but they are being consumed in the West. So I was just talking to an environmental expert, and he was saying that, there are two ways of counting carbon emissions. One is production-based, and most people use the production-based method because it is the easiest to count, because national income statistics are there and so on. But you could count it on a consumption basis. And if you count it on a consumption basis, America would come out looking a lot worse than China, because a lot of what China is producing is actually going elsewhere. So if there is a great demand on African resources, it's not just China's demand, and China is supplying some other markets. And as I said, the story is more complicated. And again, I keep advertising my writings, but I did write a very long piece on it was more on the financial side, but I did cover, you have to cover the productive side as well. So it's a piece about the implications of Africa's relationship with China for Africa's economic and monetary sovereignty. So if you like, again, I can share it with you. It's just an article. But let me just say one thing that I said, and this applies to Sri Lanka as much as it applies to India, to Philippines, and Africa, and many other places. China's rise is a threat in many ways to the manufacturing sectors of all these countries, whether the manufacturing sector is substantial or not. And the only way of dealing with this is essentially to, in your own way, but to take a leaf or two out of China's book, because what all of us need, what all of our economies need, are genuine developmental states which are able to create and maintain productive capacity in a sufficiently large number of sectors so as to be able to have balanced trade, have mutually beneficial and balanced trade with the rest of the world. If you don't do that, then you will have your manufacturing hollowed out, as, for example, is already happening in India. I'm less sure about what's happening in Sri Lanka, but anyway, if you don't do that, so to me, what I was saying is that China is, to my mind, and from what I can see, China is a good partner, a better partner for African countries, but it will be an even better partner in terms of trade, financial flows, etc., if you are able to, if each African country or African countries collectively can create a developmental state, because China has one. And all countries need one for their own benefit. And if you don't create your own developmental state, and then you say, because China is not forcing any country to trade with it. If you say, well, Chinese manufacturing is hollowing, Chinese exports are hollowing out our manufacturing, well, that's not very fair, because it's not like, it's not like imperial one-way free trade where India had no choice, or British India had no choice but to accept British imports, British exports. We are meaningfully independent countries. We have choices and we have to exercise them. And that's what China has done. That's why China is as strong as it is productively. So
I think there's another question coming in. Please go ahead. I can see a raised hand here.
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, since we are discussing about China, I would like to relate the Chinese question with the situation in Afghanistan. So we saw that Chinese, they recognize the Taliban government, and there are like competing narratives about this. So some people argue that this comes from the traditional non-interventionist stance of China, but some argues that this is a plan of Chinese expansionism. So I would like to know how would you explain it?
I would say that it would, I wouldn't call it expansionism, but I would say, well, first of all, let's begin with the beginning. I'm not sure China has formally recognized the Taliban, but it is dealing with the Taliban. So that's the first small clarification I would make. If something has happened in the last couple of days that I haven't read, then I may be wrong, but I don't think it has formally recognized it. It is talking with them. And definitely you are right, it is talking about investments and all sorts of things. Now, all of this is taking place in a context where you have to remember that the Americans are withholding some $9 billion worth of Afghan reserves, which they have no right to. It is completely illegal, but they are withholding these monies, just as they are doing in the case of Venezuela, even in the case of Cuba. They are making it very difficult for these countries at a time when their needs are very high. Particularly with COVID, they are creating it very difficult for these countries to buy medicines, vaccines, etc., etc. So that's what the Americans are doing. Now, in this context, the Taliban government, as I was reading, there was some news headline, we've got, this 30 million plus people, a society of 30 million plus people to serve and no money to serve it with. So that's the situation they're in. And no wonder they're talking to whoever they will talk with them, whether it's the Russians or the Chinese, etc. Secondly, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that for the Chinese, this is a big gain and they will seek to expand their Belt and Road Initiative through there. But again, I don't see the Belt and Road Initiative as expansionism in the imperialist sense. I think it's considerably different. I think it has been serving the interests of the people to whom it has gone. And that's why you have countries enthusiastically participating, including Pakistan, and for that matter, Sri Lanka and others. So I would say that, China and Pakistan, I think one final point. The key point the key thing that the Chinese wanted from the Taliban in the first instance was that the Taliban should promise that they will not let Afghanistan be a territory from which a destabilization can be launched in China, particularly in Xinjiang. And this is not a surprising demand, given that the Americans have been supporting the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which until recently was declared as a terrorist organization, and it has recently been delisted from that list by the Americans. So I can entirely understand that. So.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your interesting presentation and your elaboration. My first question is, are there any structural similarities and difference between American defeat in Vietnam, Soviet defeat in Afghanistan, and again, American defeat in Afghanistan? The second question, at the time of the Vietnam War, the leftist groups, progressive academics, and various leftist parties all over the world, they celebrated Vietnamians' victory. But regarding Mujahideen in Afghan, Russian, Soviet war, and Taliban in American Afghan war, no one can celebrate their victory. What is this phenomena? How would you understand this special phenomena?
Okay, well, let me begin with the second question first. I completely agree with you. I mean, obviously, it is not, it was relatively easy for people to see, to celebrate the Vietnamese victory. After all, it was a consciously organized communist force, a peasant society, which people could relate to in some ways, if not, even though it was not, a Western type of society, etc., and so on. The Taliban, well, it's been, remember, people say 20-year American occupation, but Afghanistan has been at war for 40 years. And Americans have been involved in Afghanistan for 40 years. So, what the Taliban that has been created is in a very substantial, to a very substantial extent the result of American intervention. And the encouragement by the Americans of this Wahhabi style Islam, which brought you Taliban Mark I in the 1990s. So that's one thing. Secondly, there is no doubt in my mind that the ease with which the Taliban have come to control Afghanistan has also ensured that they are tempered to some extent, that their fanatical Wahhabism is considerably tempered. You can't hold the loyalty of a population that is not, the Afghans are not going to be Islamic fundamentalists. There are a few among them, but they're not all Islamic fundamentalists. And in order to keep the loyalty of this population, you have to bend a lot. And they seem to have learned how to do it. But I'm not going to stick my neck out. I'm just saying that this is what I think at the moment. I may change my mind if I see other things happening, but that's what I think at the moment. Recently, I read, somebody cited to me, and I read this very interesting article in the New Yorker, which is apparently based on a book by the journalist Anand Gopal. It's called The Other Afghan Women. And it's really worth reading, because what we see in the Western media are these, like Priya was saying at the beginning, when we talk about American control over Afghanistan, you're talking about Kabul, sort of metropolitan Kabul, with all the multitude of NGOs and English-speaking people, women, etc., whatever. And and yes, it's very likely that the lives of many of these women was endangered when the Taliban took over. There is no, I believe that, but they were also clearly on the other side. In Afghanistan itself, it seems to me, from what I read, I merely cite this essay as one among many things you could read, but it's a very powerful essay and it's worth reading. I think that people really saw the American occupation was never legitimate, not legitimate among men, women, etc. It led to a profound breakdown of normal structures. As I said, it has led to a huge drug economy and so on. So everybody can see that it has set them back. Now, exactly, so the social character of the Taliban is very mixed. It certainly reflects certain atavistic characters which they retain from the past, from the 1990s, but it also reflects a certain tempering. So now the question is, to what extent will Afghan people, having thrown out the foreign occupiers, will be able to take control of their own destinies? It's also very clear to me that there are power struggles going on within the Taliban itself, on the one hand, between certain atavistic elements and the ones who are more willing to make compromises and say, look, we have to keep our legitimacy, and we have to bend a little towards what people need and want. And also how women and men and other people will take power in their own hands and try to exercise it. It's still very early days, but I agree with you. The social character of the Taliban makes it very difficult to celebrate in any way. The only thing we can celebrate is the fact that it is a setback for imperialism, and that they have been thrown out. So that's the only progressive thing I see here, but I do think that is something progressive, and now we have to see what happens. So yeah, does that, oh yes, and you had another question. I've forgotten now what it was. The first one.
Yeah, my first question is, are there any structural similarities between
yes,
the Vietnam war, the American defeat in Vietnam War,
Right.
and Russian defeat in Afghanistan, and American defeat in again Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, clearly there are similarities. I mean, like you saw with the airlifts and everything, you know, the Americans sort of, again, for similar reasons, because of mixed motives, because, you know, the military industrial complex is saying one thing and the military intelligence is saying another thing, and so on and so forth. They were wrong-footed, they were badly, you know, painted themselves into a corner, they had to leave, etc. And by the way, economic, you know, dollar-related imperatives also mattered. In that case, this is a difference. In that case, the Europeans were deeply opposed to the Americans persecuting the war at their expense, as they saw it. And they rightly should have been. And essentially, they began to put their foot down in the late 1960s, even ensuring that Lyndon Johnson, who could have run for a second term, because he only did one full term, decided not to run again. So anyway, the point of all this is simply to say that there are similarities. The big difference to me, apart from these one or two other differences I pointed out, is that the withdrawal from Kabul is much more serious. It's much more ignominious, a defeat for the Americans, because, you know, the Vietnamese were backed by the Russians and the Chinese. The Taliban were not backed by anybody. They were not backed by anybody. They managed to. There was another important difference, perhaps I should mention it. You may not think it's particularly relevant, but I think it's actually very relevant, because it makes the American army a less serious proposition. Because in Vietnam, you had a huge groundswell of opposition to the Vietnam War because of the draft, because ordinary Americans had to go and fight. But now what happens is you have essentially a completely professional army. Now, at one level, that should be an advantage, but it's only an advantage if you don't have a military industrial complex. But they do. So essentially what you have now is a so-called professional army in which people of the lower classes are disproportionately represented. Black people are disproportionately represented. They have to go and recruit women because they can't get enough men. There's a small number of personnel who do repeated tours of duty. They then come back, they are traumatized, they are suffering from PTSD, etc., etc. And the state does not very well look after them, as you probably are aware. And so on the one hand, the level, so that's another reason why the war continued for so long, because the sections of society that were directly affected by kids dying, etc., was a tiny section of society, because there was no draft. So people were not so, the opposition to the war was not so widespread. During the first decade of the war in Afghanistan, the Americans were being told by George Bush Jr. that their principal duty was to go shopping. This is when Americans are dying, right? So this is the irony of it, you know, that, so in many ways, it just shows you the incredible dysfunction of the American imperial project. I still say it's a project. It was never accomplished. It's there, project is there. They are going to try to pursue it, but they are going to do it ever more irrationally and desperately. I will say one other thing. The very fact that Trump was elected demonstrates a level of dysfunctionality of the American system at home, the American political economy at home, which is quite remarkable, because essentially in the pursuit of world domination, let's put it that way, the Americans have so neglected their own economy. They have allowed very large parts of their manufacturing to be hollowed out, huge swaths of Rust Belt, what's it called? Rust Belt, blue wall, as it was called, that is to say, nominally democratic constituencies, which Trump managed to win, because the political establishment of both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, are totally pro-war, pro-Wall Street, do not give a care to reviving the national economy, to creating better jobs, full employment, to increasing wages, etc., etc. They don't care about any of this. So as a result, it took an outsider to get the nomination for the Republican Party. And of course, being who he is, Trump only exploited the divisions of American society. Whereas what they really need is somebody to heal them. And Sanders might have begun to do something like that, but of course, the most determined effort was made to ensure that he would not get the Democratic ticket. So this is the kind of establishment that this imperial project has created. It does not serve American people very well. The Americans, I was saying that the Indians and the Sri Lankans need a developmental state. The Americans need a developmental state too. That's what they really need, but they can't have it as long as they keep trying to say that, you know, the whole world economy should remain open, and therefore they have to, at least to some degree, keep their own economy open.
Radhika, there is I need to leave now for a personal reason, and I'll ask Sumane to take over. It was amazing listening to you. Hope we connect once again, and would try and get the manifesto translated in Bengali, and we'll be in touch with you. And thank you so much, Sumane, for the invitation. It was so nice connecting with everyone. And I'm really sorry that I have to leave because there is an urgent personal requirement. Thank you so much.
No worries. Yeah.
Professor, you're muted.
Yeah, I should first thank Priya for moderating this session. We have another 15 minutes or like that. And there's one person, Senani. Senani has a question or to make a comment. Senani? Hello?
We can't hear you, sir.
No, I'm not muted. Hello? Can you hear me?
Hear you now, yeah.
Yeah, Senani, you have a question. Probably she can't hear me.
Maybe not, yeah.
All right. Senani, you can ask your question now.
I think she's having some technical difficulties.
Oh, any other person? Until she correct that technical problem. So, Senani.
Yeah. While she's, can I ask, make a request actually to Radhika, like, if you don't mind, Radhika, you know, you can share in the chat, you know, the couple of 2 or 3 papers, you know,
oh yeah,
that you mentioned, you know, if you in PDF form.
I wonder if I can. Let me just see. Oh yes, here we go. Oh, okay, here we go. Attach. I got it. I will share a couple of papers.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you. Well, until she comes, I'll ask a question.
Okay.
I think it's very nice for you to paint US imperialism as a project, which is never completed. Of course, I accept your thing that I'm saying that the US imperialism has weakened and the defeat in Afghanistan has expressed that. But at the same time, I can say there are 2 countervailing forces.
Mm-hmm.
One is when if US imperialism or whatever imperialism, whether it's the British or US, when they found some kind of weaknesses, they are trying to restructure it. Now, can't we see a kind of restructuring taking place that US imperialism making a very close contact with the English-speaking countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, of course, Britain and the US. I mean, that we can see from the formation of this AUKUS, sort of to counter the South China Sea area. And the second point is when imperialism is actually internally generated project as a project of capitalism, the extension of project of capitalism. So until and unless we overthrow capitalism, that imperialist project, whether it is US or something, will persist. So although we can accept that US imperialism is weakening, but at the same time say that there are some countervailing forces that allow some kind of imperialism to dominate the world. That's the first question.
Right.
The second one is, I think most of our analysis were conducted taking nation state as a point.
Please continue. I can hear you. I'm just gonna.
Sorry.
Bring the shade down because the sun is in my eyes. So
Okay.
yeah, that's better.
So nation state as a kind of a unit. Or in other words, considering world as an addition of nation state. That I can understand very well. But the point is, because now the class is not a it's not a dominant factor, it put it in dormant place. So my question is, if classes start to sort of activate, then what would be the kind of changes that we can think of this geopolitical system? That's the second question. Right. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So let me start with the. Okay. So the first question is, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Americans will not continue to try to impose their order. They will certainly restructure, but the resources they have with which to restructure and remount this project are ever shrinking. They have been shrinking for a long time. That's partly what I show in geopolitical economies. They are shrinking. Their ability to do what they want to do is shrinking. Now, of course, remember that the American imperial project, as I call it, is one of essentially recreating under American auspices the kind of domination that the British exercised in the 19th century. That is what I said never succeeded. But that does not mean that America does not exert an enormous amount of imperial power, say vis-a-vis Cuba or Venezuela or, many other countries. It does. But what it never did was achieve this goal. That's the second point. The third point is that increasingly the fact of the matter is that if what I underlined earlier is true, which is that, before the First World War, the various advanced capitalist countries, the Germans, the Japanese, the Americans, were all competing with one another, right? This is what led to the First World War. We could see the recreation of such competition. Whether it will be as dangerous as before, I don't know. One very critical thing that is different in relation, different today than it was in the run-up to the First World War, is that back then there were still territories that could be relatively easily acquired. There were enough weak states that could be overpowered. I think today that is much more difficult. And I think people are aware of this. And there are other differences as well. I mean, I would say that I presume that the greater material well-being, education, cultural development, etc., of ordinary people in countries around the world will make a big difference in terms of, whether countries can easily go to war or not, etc. So that's the first point. So I'm not saying that they will not try. I'm saying that my point is not that they are not trying. The Americans have tried nothing as hard The Americans have never tried harder to try to achieve some sort of imperialism. What I'm underlining is that they have failed because they are not able to. This is the zeal has always been there, the energy has been there, but the ability has not been there. Partly because the reality of the world is different. It was already pluripolar back in the 1870s. So the American project was being prosecuted on a very different terrain on which it could not succeed. But that does not mean they will not try as far as possible to exert influence over weaker economies, weaker countries, etc. And increasingly, the French, for example, in West Africa and elsewhere, and so they will also do so independently. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you raise the situation about, the English-speaking countries. Yeah, I think that's clearly what they are trying. Of course, you remember that there is also the Five Eyes organization, the Canada, US, Australia, Canada, US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand all form part of a intelligence network in which they share intelligence with each other. So that's coordination has always been there. And there is also the possibility that Japan and India will be dragooned into this, or they will go into this happily. So they are definitely trying to reconstitute themselves, but there are a couple of forces militating against it. Number one, or three or four, let's put it that way. Number one, China's own power is today very great. It is not easy to take on China. Militarily, economically, in any way. Number two, the United States itself and other capitalist countries, whether it is the United States or Canada or Japan, Western Europe, you name it, Western European countries, you name it, all these countries, they have capitalist classes that are deeply split. On the one hand, the military-industrial complex and the need to feed it requires that you keep up a very high decibel anti-China rhetoric, because otherwise you cannot justify giving more and more money, because while the Americans are withdrawing from Afghanistan, the military budget is still growing in America. So for this has to be maintained in some way. So there is a split in the capitalist classes, those who want to do business with China and those who don't mind doing business with China, but would like to subordinate to the larger goal of keeping the military industrial complex going. So I think that's one set of considerations. And this is so in all of these countries. So in Britain, for example, I don't know if you know, but a few years ago, when the China threat was already being quite severely felt, the British joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, despite the fact that the Obama administration was very upset about it. So there are divisions that are showing, and these divisions are about. So that's one set of points. The other is that Russia and China are increasingly cooperating. And I think this is a point of enormous significance. I think that the Americans, in the past, the Nixon drove a wedge between the two, as you know, between the Soviet Union and China. But now it seems as though this is, for whatever reason, the West is only only pushing the two together. And I think that Russia and China certainly can have a very good mutually cooperative relationship, and they are having one. And so I think that this unity will be quite important. Yes, and finally, I would say that more broadly speaking, even when it comes to countries like Japan, they are themselves economically so complexly intertwined with the economy of China that they are in a very difficult place. So it is very difficult for them to make an enemy out of China in a simplistic fashion. So, as a friend of mine likes to say, the West cannot kill China, but they can try to essentially persuade China to commit suicide, essentially by persuading China to become more and more neoliberal and capitalist. But I think that what has become clear over the last several years in particular, but in fact, since the 2008, but particularly in the last several years, is that this is not so easy to do. China has responded to all the challenges over recent times by actually digging in deeper into the socialist groove rather than going in the direction of capitalism. So, I don't doubt at all that there are powerful constituencies in China, people who are capitalists themselves, many bureaucrats who have been either educated in the West or they have been, one of the things that appalls me about China when I go there is that in their economics departments, they just teach straightforward neoclassical economics. That's not what they need. They need something, they need a socialist economics. But anyway, so I have no doubt that there are powerful constituencies in China who want to turn China neoliberal and capitalist. But so far they have not succeeded. And if they do succeed, I don't think they will succeed, but should they succeed, that will be the end of China's that would be the end of China's successes. It would essentially make China into another declining neoliberal capitalism. And by the way, that's the reason why I made it a point of underlining that I also feel that this is the end of the road for capitalism. I don't think capitalism is capable of delivering substantial growth and sufficiently broadly based growth, even in the imperialist countries, let alone in third world countries.
I think now Senani can ask her question. Senani?
Professor, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to know Professor Desai's thoughts on sensationalized media portrayals of the US defeat as US withdrawal and the importance of proposing new understanding of contemporary challenges that confronts the mainstream narratives.
So you mean to say that you don't think it was a defeat?
I do think it's a defeat. So what I want to do is I wanted to say was the media sensationalized the portrayal of the US defeat as a US withdrawal.
I see. Right. Or rather try to desensationalize it. Because yes. I would sensationalize it if it were up to me. But I see what you're saying. Yes, I think there have been in some corners of the Western press a sort of emphasis on, how this is a planned withdrawal and, okay, not everything went as planned, but I think it was a complete shambles. And so that's why it's important to understand that this is really it's not just what happened in the last 2 months, but what happened in the last 2 months says about what happened in the last 2 decades. And what a deep failure this is on the part of the Americans. And, look, I mean, Madeleine Albright said, what's the point of having the world's most powerful army if you can't use it? Right. But what's the point of having the world's most powerful army if it can't win a war against an impoverished nation of 30 million people, a tenth the size of the United States? What's the point? I mean, why are you spending so much money on it? I mean, give me a justification. I mean, this fact alone should make people question the veracity of claims about the success of American imperialism. I mean, forget all the complicated stuff we talk about, political economy and so on, just this very simple fact. And as various writers on the Vietnam War have emphasized, the reason the Americans lost the Vietnam War is that in the end, they could not, essentially a not particularly coherent invading force could not win against a people who were determined to defend their country. It's the long and short of it. Wars are not just technical, not just who has the best technology. It's about also who has the most commitment.
Right. Thank you.
We can allow one more question, and then we can wind up the session. If anybody wants to ask a question or to make a comment.
So if there's no one, I just posted a comment by
Jude, right. Yeah.
Posted a comment by former Premier of China, Wen Jiabo. Basically talks about this is from Reuters, September 29th, right? So my question is this crisis is very different from the crisis in America or the Western Europe? If you look at who really suffers from the crisis is in the US, it's the underclass and the people of color. In China, it's the ethnic minorities, Muslims in China, minorities, right? So I am just wondering whether this is sort of any different. I still don't understand why to paint China is very different as imperial power, or the way that the capitalism functions in China is very different from the way capitalism functions in the rest of the world. True that also you made a comment that what's the point of having a military if we can't win a war against an impoverished poor nation? But I think the military, even though it didn't win the war, it has helped the class that make enormous amount of money from the military, right?
Look, I think you are okay. So you raised 3 points, and I will take them in turn. So first of all, you said something about the minorities, and I think that the best I could do is I could ask you to read the information, the dossier put together on Xinjiang by the Qiao Collective. If you just Google them, you will find it. QIAO, Qiao Collective. It's very informative, and I think it's fairly balanced. I think that basically this idea of the persecution of minorities in China is, I find it is not credible at all. And this is being, China is being accused of genocide by a country like Canada, whose genocide is actually visible before your eyes. And so this hypocrisy is completely ludicrous. Xinjiang is a province where there was a threat of foreign-sponsored terrorism. The Chinese have taken, I think, good care of it. The Chinese are out to develop this part of the country. They are there are in terms of cultural persecution, there are I've not been there, but I've talked to people who've been to Xinjiang. There is a thriving Islamic culture there, and by the way, I should say I was myself surprised to find there is actually a thriving Islamic culture even in Chinese universities. So I've been to a couple where there is actually what they call a Muslim restaurant, that is to say places where you will find the food that is, cooked by these minorities and enjoyed by them, and Chinese people enjoy them too. What I'm simply trying to say is there is no suppression. There are mosques, a dime a dozen in Xinjiang, and Muslims do, their script, their language, their script, their culture, etc. These are all quite intact. Their population is increasing. So these ideas that are put forward by the likes of Adrian Zenz, etc., they're just complete rubbish. I mean, how do you have genocide when the ethnic population is expanding? So that's, as I say, there's a lot of information out there. If you want, you could take a look at it. Then you raise the point about China's real estate bubble. So it's true. So Evergrande is going into, is having financial problems. But what people forget is that the Chinese financial system is not like the American financial system. The Chinese financial system is what, in fact, it's, first of all, it's a publicly owned financial system, or largely publicly owned financial system, in which it is possible for the state to intervene and make correct imbalances. So clearly, the Evergrande situation has revealed a number of imbalances. But remember also that Evergrande is an entity in which the Westerners have also invested a great deal. So they are worried about their investment. But you know what? Sometimes you lose your investment. It's not, the Chinese state is not required to bail out Western people who've already made a fair bit of money out of Evergrande. I think that it's quite possible that there is a certain bubble element to the Evergrande situation. And if there is, then I would say that I will be watching for, because it's still an evolving situation, I'll be watching for some ways in which the Chinese seek to correct it. Because look at it this way, back when, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, when China suffered a pretty sharp trade shock, the immediate reaction of this party state was to launch an enormous investment drive. Then about 3 odd years later, this investment drive, they reckoned, had taken matters as far as it could. And then they deliberately changed the emphasis to allowing wages to rise and allowing domestic consumption to rise. And I think now that has become officially, increasing domestic investment and domestic consumption has become officially the the new way forward as consciously recognized by the party state in its so-called dual circulation model. So that, yes, exports are good, exports, imports are, part of what the Chinese do, but they are also engaging, they also realize that their most important growth stimulus is domestic investment and consumption. So to me, so in the Western financial system, what you had is essentially the big bankers were bailed out and the ordinary people were basically, they got nothing. The people who were left with no homes, who lost their homes, their jobs, etc., they simply suffered a decade and today more of austerity. This is not about to happen in China because the Chinese will bail out whatever is necessary, but they're not going to bail out in such a way as to enrich a tiny minority and impoverish the large majority. So that is, I don't think, going to happen. Your final point was about, but Madeleine Albright's thing. Look, I don't think you got the irony of my comment. My point was that if Madeleine Albright says this, then what about this? I'm not saying that countries should go to war or maintain armies in order to go to war against poor countries. I would hardly say such a thing. Countries, insofar as it is necessary, should maintain some basic defense. In fact, here in Canada, I have I worked with someone who ran for the leadership of the Green Party as an eco-socialist, and our position was we hardly need an army. What do you need it for? Who are you going to war with? Do you really think that the Americans are going to attack, etc.? So the point is that, my point is simply that I was turning around what Madeleine Albright said. I don't think the Americans should be attacking anybody. I don't think the Americans should be spending such astronomical sums on their army. I think the Americans should realize that they are just an ordinary, that it's an ordinary country. Yes, they're a big country, but they're an ordinary country. They should take care of their own. They should focus on taking care of their own. And if they did that, they would give the Chinese a better run for their money than what they're actually doing, which is on the one hand, financializing, abandoning the productive economy, abandoning workers and employment, and engaging in military misadventures of this scale.
Any questions? Or shall we wind up now? Now it's 9:50. I think we have spent about 2 hours and 15 minutes discussion. I should thank Professor Radhika Desai for making very lucid presentation, covering many spaces, and opening up for a discussion on not only on Afghanistan and China, but also many developments worldwide. So I will thank again Radhika for accepting our invitation, and we hope to invite you once again when we are proceeding.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed our conversations, and I'm really glad to make so many new friends. And do take a look at the manifesto, which I have put in the chat. Please be in touch with me if you have any questions about anything.
Yeah, send the manifesto, and it's in the chat box. So I think we can discuss how we are going to translate it. And we might be able to translate it into Sinhala and Tamil most probably. And Priya will do the Bengali translation. Do you want us to find signatures to that?
If you would, I invite everyone here to consider signing it if you like it. And absolutely, please circulate as widely as possible to anyone you think will be interested.
Right, right. Yeah. So we'll do that. And I will make arrangement to send I think Chami can send the manifesto to other members of the Marx School.
Great.
And then we can ask them to sign it if they agree with the main argument of the manifesto.
Great.
Yeah, and thank you very much again. And thanks all for coming to Marx School today. And our next program is next week, next Saturday. It's in Sinhala. It's on Marxism and Art by Darshan Kananka. And after that, on 16th, we have a discussion on environmental ecology and environment, that kind of issues, by Mahesh Rajapaksa. With that, I will I'll wind up this session, and thanking again Radhika for accepting our invitation and making a very lucid presentation on the global political situation too. Thank you very much.
Well
Thanks
done.
all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.